Well, hello and welcome to my talk for World Rivers Day 2024, hosted by Aberystwyth University. My thanks to the organisers for inviting me along. My name is Associate Professor Tim Ralph from Macquarie University in Australia, and I'm going to talk today about dryland rivers and the science policy interface from an Australian perspective. I'd like to recognise the country that I'm on today, the land of the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation, and I acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, who have nurtured and continue to nurture this country. So I'm going to talk about dryland rivers in Australia, and that's important because more than 70% of Australian rivers are classified as non-perennial and occur in dry landscapes that typically have a net deficit of water availability. It's a combination of our ancient landscapes, generally dry climates, highly variable rainfall, and human interventions that have shaped and continue to alter our riverine environments. And so understanding river ecology, hydrology, biogeochemistry, geomorphology, and Indigenous values are critical for river conservation and management here in Australia. You can see from the images on this slide that there are a range of different rivers right across the continent, ranging from semi-seasonal or perennial rivers near the coast to much more ephemeral, irregularly flowing rivers in the central parts of the continent. And these vary in terms of their geomorphology, the ecology, and obviously hydrology. And so for Australian river managers and scientists, it's very important to understand the breadth of different river types that we have in our continent and to understand how we can conserve and manage those in an appropriate way. A recent review by Shannafield and others showed that the dominant research themes for Australian dryland rivers have been floods and droughts, salinity, dryland ecology, and water management. And this is important to recognise because there are some key research areas missing from the literature, or if they're not missing, they're only touched on briefly in many cases. So it's clear that future research must continue along some of these themes, but also start to address emerging threats to our rivers due to climate change and anthropogenic impacts. These include the role of extreme events, the water quality and quantity issues that we're facing under future climates, the interactions between surface water and groundwater, and of course, the role and response of people and our interventions and management strategies. Adequately measuring and monitoring what we are doing to rivers is a critical part of the future research needs here in Australia. The photographs on this slide show some distinctive channels, wetlands, and waterholes that occur in different dryland rivers across the continent. And they range from continuous through-going rivers to rivers that break down or even terminate in floodouts or wetlands. They might be surrounded by ephemeral or seasonal wetland vegetation, or they could be surrounded by true dryland soils. These are soils that do not rely on any form of inundation for their maintenance or ecology. And so we have a wide range of rivers of different styles here in Australia that we are trying to understand and manage. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know as Australia's food bowl, the Murray-Darling Basin, because this is where a lot of my own work on geomorphology, hydrology, and aquatic ecology of inland rivers has taken place. The Murray-Darling Basin generally has a very low relief and dry semi-arid landscape. The majority of the basin is situated west of the Great Dividing Range on the southeastern part of Australia. And so most of the rivers in the basin run inland away from the coast into progressively drier environments. You can see from the map and the hydrographs here shown on the slide that some rivers have highly variable flow regimes. For example, in the northwestern part of the basin, the Paru River and the Warrego River have very sporadic flow, whereas in the southern and eastern parts of the basin, rivers such as the Murray and the Murrumbidgee have more regular or seasonal flow regimes. This is because of the different climates across the basin, the dominance of winter rainfall and seasonal flow in the south compared with summer rainfall and storm-driven flow in the north. And so it's clear that highly variable climate and hydrology drive floods and droughts across the Murray-Darling Basin. And despite this, the rivers have some common trends. So we see typically in these rivers a general downstream decline in catchment connectivity due to the absence of hill slopes in the lower parts of the river. We also see downstream declines in discharge and stream power as these rivers move further away from their catchments, which are source of most of their water. Sediment size and transport volumes tend to decline downstream as sediment accumulation takes over. And channel size and capacity also tend to decline downstream along these rivers. Conversely, we tend to see downstream increases in things like overbank flooding and floodplain connectivity. So as the rivers emerge into broad and relatively flat alluvial landscapes, they can flood out and spread water across the floodplains more readily. We also see an increasing dominance of cohesive sediment, and so many of the rivers have very muddy bed and banks in their lower reaches. The number of channels tends to increase downstream as processes like avulsion take over, and channel splitting and even floodouts, the termination of channels on the floodplain, are a common feature of many of these rivers. We also see an increase in the extent and the number of wetlands as we move down through these rivers, particularly floodplain wetlands and lakes, which occur in the distal reaches and are fed by large flood events. This is an example from Western New South Wales of Wonnara Creek, which is a dryland river that has very rare sporadic flow events, so flash floods dominate this system. It occurs on a moderately sloping valley floor, but is highly susceptible to gully erosion on the floodplain. And you can see here in the bed of the dry river, we have some small variations where we have accumulations of coarse sediment and fine sediment, which effectively show us where the pools along this river would occur during wet periods. You can see that the riparian vegetation occurs in a fairly narrow strip around the river, and these trees have deep taproots that utilize groundwater in the system to survive through the long periods of drought. So this is a classic dryland river in the western part of New South Wales, the western side of the Murray-Darling Basin. Conversely, this is a more seasonally flooded river and its wetland. This is the Macquarie Marshes on the lower reaches of the Macquarie River in central New South Wales, or the central Murray-Darling Basin. This river has more seasonal flow than Wonnara Creek. The wetlands here are almost permanent. This is where the main river almost terminates completely in a wetland. You can see wetland occurring on both sides of the channel here. You can see water spilling through the reeds and through the trees to feed the wetlands. And so those two videos just show you some really contrasting features of our dryland rivers here in the Murray-Darling. What I'll talk about now to wrap up is how science and policy work together in Australia. So we have three levels of government in Australia that are responsible for rivers and wetlands and the water within them. At the broadest level, the federal government implements national water policy, things like our Water Act and our Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. The federal government also coordinates interstate cooperation and manages rivers and wetlands of national or sometimes international, in the case of wetlands, importance, particularly for transboundary systems. That means rivers that cross over state boundaries. The Murray-Darling Basin is a key example of this because many of the large rivers in the Murray-Darling, particularly the Murray and the Darling, cross state boundaries. And so federal government management policy and actions are very important in that system, as well as lower level state and local government management. So at the state level, state and territory governments manage water resources within their state boundary. They are the ones responsible for water licensing and allocation. They're responsible for catchment management and also the implementation and monitoring of things like environmental flows, releases from dams targeted at environmental outcomes. At the smaller scale, we have local councils and regional authorities which are responsible for land use planning and infrastructure and urban creeks and stormwater. The challenge really is for our policy makers and activators to work across these three scales collaboratively to achieve the right outcomes for the rivers that we are interested in. And that's really where our science and policy interface sits. So this diagram shows some of the ways that interactions between scientists and policies occur here in Australia. In terms of policy processes and activities, we're talking about things like agenda setting, analysis of management strategies or policy decisions, implementations of legal acts and things like that, and broad level monitoring and adaptation. The role and tasks of scientists fall into the central category, green here in this diagram, which are really focused on generating new knowledge to inform policy and management, to evaluate policy, to innovate and validate some of the different processes, and at times to advocate or to suggest options for the policy processes and activities. And of course, scientists can take a range of stances in their work. Some scientists focus just on the science, so they're pure scientists. Others focused on more applied aspects of science and work closely with policy makers and managers. And some scientists take an issue advocate approach where they really push and support particular issues and target their research towards those. So there are many and some complex interactions between science and policy occurring across Australia. And from these, I've identified just three major issues which really sit at the science policy interface that Australia is grappling with at the moment. The first is water allocation and management. Of course, this occurs and is important across federal, state, and local boundaries. And so what we're talking about here is really concerns over droughts and water shortages, things like over-extraction of water and its impact on biodiversity, and the implementation of sustainable water sharing agreements. The second major issue sitting at the science policy interface here in Australia is environmental degradation and river health. We're talking about agricultural runoff and industrial pollution, altered flow regimes in rivers due to damming and other forms of modification, and loss of biodiversity, particularly things like native fish and bird species. The third major issue are climate change impacts. This revolves around things like the need for adaptation strategies that really accept and integrate changing hydrological patterns in rivers, impacts to address the protection of ecosystems under increased stress, and to ensure resilience of water systems for both human and ecological use. So some complex science policy issues there that we need both science and policy activities directed towards and integrated in order to address. So looking to the future, the fundamental things here in Australia that we are pushing and need to do are to integrate Indigenous and Western scientific knowledge, to quantify climate change impacts on river structure and function, to develop meaningful and targeted goals for conservation and restoration, to implement science and policy across different scales, for example, the spatial scales, the federal, state, and local scales, over time to make sure there is continuity and sustainability going forward into the future, and of course, across different socioeconomic, political, or management cycles. And these challenges all require inter and multidisciplinary efforts supported by technological advances. The diagram on the right here is from Russell et al. And shows how some of our global stream management industry activities can work together to meet some much larger scale national and international obligations, for example, the United Nations goals. And what we need to do there is to work holistically, to implement nature-based solutions, to substantially improve our resource for the industry and to promote active management, to preserve and use what we already know more effectively, and to create a step change in the industry and influence to implement large-scale river management. So thank you for listening. I'll leave my presentation off there. I wish you all the best for World Rivers Day 2024. Thank you and all the best.